My guest at this time is Gordon Chang. He's an East Asia policy expert. He's the author of The Coming Collapse of China, and he has joined us a number of times to talk about the significance of the ongoing pro-freedom protests in Hong Kong. And today, Gordon joins us from Hong Kong to react to the big news that the legislation that initially triggered these major protests has officially been withdrawn. But it doesn't mean the end of the protests. And Gordon, thanks very much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Greg.
Well, the news from Carrie Lam, the head of the government there in Hong Kong, is that the extradition bill is going to be officially withdrawn. This is legislation that would have allowed suspects to be extradited to mainland China. And she has officially withdrawn it. But of course, in the intervening weeks, there's been a whole lot of other problems, including police brutality and other heavy-handed moves from the Chinese government inside Hong Kong. But let's start with this. Why now? Why do you think Carrie Lam and other authorities decided to formally withdraw the extradition bill now?
Yeah, I don't know the why now, but clearly whatever the government has done hasn't worked. Also, it hasn't been Carrie Lam who made that decision. That decision was made in Beijing, and then Carrie Lam announced it. And I think China right now is trying to tamp down sentiment, especially because it has a big anniversary coming up, which is October 1st, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. So right now, I think Beijing is searching for ways to try to quell protests, but this isn't going to do it. And I know that for certain because after Carrie Lam's announcement, I went to a demonstration at the Mong Kok police station, and there is no less of fervor on the part of the students and the kids.
Well, as you have told us in recent weeks, Gordon, there were 5 demands from the protesters at this point, not just the removal of the extradition bill. So what are those other 4, and what's the response so far from the authorities?
On the other 4, one of them was an independent inquiry into the conduct of the police. And Carrie Lam has said that she's going to conduct an inquiry, but only through an existing police body. That's certainly not going to be effective. The other is the release of all the demonstrators, and also the retraction of the word riot as a description for what has occurred in Hong Kong. And the remaining one is a big demand, and that is universal suffrage for the selection of the chief executive and for members of the Legislative Council. So those are big demands. And even if she were to meet all 5 at this time, it's not clear that the protesters would go home because many of them want something else, and that is independence from China.
Is there any way to put the genie back in the bottle, particularly when it comes to the police? You told us very clearly in previous interviews that there used to be this pretty symbiotic relationship, a lot of respect between the public and the police, and now with the police cracking down on the protesters more than they had in the past, is there any way to restore that?
I don't think so, at least not for a very long time. There was a protest last night, which I didn't go to, at Kowloon Bay, but my colleagues from the American Conservative Union who are here did go, and they witnessed something which was extraordinary, and that is the police arrested a demonstrator, but the residents of the neighborhood came out and tried to block the police. And so these people were not protesters as such, but they are just such anger at the police that right now I think that the police are almost viewed as an occupying force.
What do you expect to be the reaction from Beijing when they discover, and I guess they already have discovered, that removing the extradition bill isn't going to solve their problems? What are they going to do now in response to the ongoing protests?
I don't think they have anything they can do. You know, of course, they could formally deploy the People's Armed Police or the People's Liberation Army to the streets of Hong Kong. That would make matters worse for them. Right now, I don't think that they have any solutions which are politically acceptable in Beijing. So at this time, I think we can just see that the protests will continue for quite some time.
We've also talked about how you're not pleased with the frequency and the strength of the statements in support of the protesters from the Trump administration. Doesn't seem like much has changed on that front. What's your take?
Yeah, I don't know what the President of the United States is going to do. I suspect that we will see more robust statements from him. Right now, I can tell you that just walking around and the demonstrators who were there at the Mongkok police station a few hours ago, they were so heartened to see Americans there. And so I think that essentially we are going to have a new realization in the U.S. that the protesters there are the front line of freedom, and that although they need us, we need them as well, because we have a common foe. And that is the one-party regime that is taking away their autonomy is also attacking our democracy. So I do expect President Trump to actually be more inspirational in coming weeks.
Take us a little more inside the protesters. We see these massive gatherings, millions literally gathering on a regular basis in Hong Kong in numbers that we can't even fathom here. Trump talks about crowd size. These are crowds that would dwarf anything we've pretty much seen in this country. You've had a chance to talk to them now. And obviously in the United States, we enjoy freedoms. We take them for granted far too often. So when you talk to these folks who are seeing that their freedoms could be slipping through their fingers here, what's it like? Talk about what they're thinking and what's motivating them here.
Yeah, there are two groups of protesters. The ones we saw tonight are the kids who sometimes adopt pretty aggressive tactics. The other is group is about 75%, maybe two-thirds of the Hong Kong population who just want to be left alone. And so there's different goals in a sense, but ultimately they both see themselves they both see Hong Kong as operating on its own. You know, right now, the interesting thing, Greg, is that the mass of people in Hong Kong are not really criticizing the youthful protesters, the ones who dress in black and sometimes adopt aggressive tactics, largely because I think the people in Hong Kong, they feel that in general they've got the same objectives. Also, people across Hong Kong society are just so upset at the excessive use of force by the Hong Kong police and, of course, the intransigence of Carrie Lam. So there is remarkably little criticism of the youthful protesters.
Last question here, Gordon. This is, I'm sure, almost impossible to gauge because things change so quickly in this story over the past several weeks. But where do you see this heading in the next, not just the few weeks leading up to the 70th anniversary of the Communist Revolution in China, but months from now? Can these protests sustain that long? Will the Chinese government have patience or concessions to make eventually? How does this play out eventually?
You would normally think, Greg, that the protests would peter out, but they haven't. I mean, they started in April, and right now we're on something like the 14th consecutive week because the big protest started on June 9th. And right now, I don't really see people giving up. So the police are going to do things which are going to aggravate the Hong Kong people. I think that Beijing's intransigence is going to get people to stay on the streets. So I see these protests continuing for a very long time. And Beijing, as I mentioned, just does not have options right now. This is going to be a continuing struggle between the two sides, which are, of course, digging in.
Gordon, we thank you for staying up late over in Hong Kong to be with us today, and thank you for your first-person perspective on the protests in Hong Kong as this unfolds. Thank you very much for your time, as always.
Oh, well, thank you, Greg.
Gordon Chang, East Asia policy expert, author of The Coming Collapse of China, joining us from Hong Kong as we continue to cover the Hong Kong protests. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.